presented by Exquisite Timepieces. More about them in the description down below and later in the video. The Ressence Type 3 BBB is not your run-of-the-mill ordinary wristwatch. At first glance, it might look a bit bizarre, or maybe even a little bit confusing. But don't worry, when I first got my hands on one of these, I wasn't exactly sure what I was looking at either. But once you take a minute to wrap your head around the design of the watch face, it's actually fairly straightforward. That said, before we jump into the dial and how it works, let's first talk about some of the notable features and specifications. First and foremost, this is not exactly what you would call an inexpensive watch. The retail price for this one comes in at $42,200. So being a watch priced well into the five figures territory and having a very unique design, I'd say that it's safe to say this isn't a watch for everybody. But for somebody looking for a luxury timepiece with some interesting design language and some serious micromechanical innovation, yeah, maybe this is the one for you. Now, as the name suggests, this is the Ressence Type 3 model in triple black configuration, meaning none of the contrasting color combinations found on similar Type 3 models are found here. Ressence also produces several models, including the Type 1, the Type 2, and the Type 5, all of which offer varying differences in terms of features and specifications. That said, one of the things that makes the Type 3 stand out, and it's a feature that's shared with the Type 5, is the oil-filled watch case. This watch features 37.5 milliliters of liquid inside the watch case between the watch face and the crystal, giving the display a level of clarity that you don't see on most watches. This oil negates the distorted perspective that you might get when you're looking at a dial of more traditional watches, and I have to say that in person, the clarity on this dial is absolutely stunning. And speaking of clarity, it's not just the daylight visibility that looks great. The lume on this watch is second to none, and it gives the wearer excellent low-light legibility as well, thanks to an extra strong application of superluminova. As for the watch case dimensions, being in a round case, it comes in at 44 millimeters in diameter with a lug-to-lug length that feels very similar in size. And I say feels because the lugs on this watch are slim bar-style lugs, and while you could measure them approximately at 50 millimeters across the span of the top to the bottom lug, being that the watch is shaped in a circular fashion and how the lugs work, it doesn't really feel like a 50 millimeter wingspan on the wrist. The watch thickness is a fairly stout 15 millimeters, but it doesn't feel quite so thick on the wrist. Now, I'm not exactly sure why I get the impression of it being slimmer, but it does feel a bit slimmer to me, despite what the measurements might suggest. Finally, the lug width where the strap attaches to the case is 22 millimeters, so fairly standard and nothing out of the ordinary in that regard. Now, the watch case is a DLC5 coated titanium with two chambers. Now, the upper half is filled with the aforementioned oil, and it has a domed sapphire crystal which surrounds the watch face as well as the case back. The dial is also in a grade 5 titanium, and it's in a convex orientation, and it features a series of subdials for displaying the hours, the day, and the date, and a thermal gauge. And the indices are engraved on the dial, and they are filled with that brilliant blue superluminova. The watch is equipped with a black bare knee leather strap and a black Ardillian buckle, and while it's a fairly simple no-frills strap system, I find it to be of nice quality and it's comfortable on the wrist. Finally, we have the movement, which I suspect will be a potential point of contention for some people. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to read the movement specs as it's listed on the Ressence website, and then we can dissect what it means after that. This movement is listed as a patented ROCS 3.5, which is Ressence Orbital Convex System, and it has a module that's driven by the minute axle of a customized 2824-2 base caliber. It includes a winding case back for day, date, and time setting as opposed to a crown, magnetic transmission, compensating bellows systems, and it's a self-winding automatic with a 36-hour power reserve running at 28,800 vibrations per hour with 47 joules. Now, that's a lot to dissect, and based on the description, I'd say that it's not exactly clear what the movement is or who exactly makes it. That said, first, let's briefly talk about how it works because I think it's pretty cool. Now, like I said, the watch is completely absent of a traditional crown and stem system. To wind the watch and to set the date and the time, you rotate the rear case back in either direction depending on the function that you're trying to interface with. And there are some helpful arrows and inscriptions on the outer edge of the case back to instruct the user on which way to spin the mechanism for the needed functionality. Now, as you can see on the watch face, we have the main central minutes hand, and as the case back rotates, so too does the minutes hand and the subdial with the hours hand. So to set the time, simply rotate the hour subdial and the minutes hand into the correct position, and you're done. Now back to that movement discussion. We have that patented Ressence Orbital Convex System, but it's a module driven by the minute axle of the base caliber 2824. Now we know the basic 2824 has a 25 joule movement, but this movement has almost double that at 47 joules. So what do we have here? Is it a really expensive ETA 2824, or is it something entirely different? Well, I think it's a little bit of both, and I think that's okay. It's very clearly an extremely complicated movement. Ressence lists it as being comprised of 215 total parts. So while it seems the base level escapement might be the ETA 2824, I think that's okay. Given all of the horological innovation that went into modifying this movement, such as removing the crown for the orbital caseback system, and creating a timepiece that includes an oil-filled watch face chamber sealed from the mechanical parts of the movement, I'm of the opinion that this is a pretty impressive timepiece regardless of the base caliber movement. That said, I suspect that there are going to be more than a handful of people that won't accept that as being quote-unquote good enough, and they will complain that the movement isn't 100% in-house manufacture. And to those people, look, I'm not going to try to change their minds. I'll simply say that they're entitled to their opinion. Now, a few more quick details about the watch, and then some of my closing thoughts with my opinions on this timepiece. Going back to the dial for a moment, there's a few things that I forgot to mention. First, we have the day and the date indicator on the watch. Now, the date is fairly easy to understand, as it resides on the outer edge of the dial in what we might look at as being the chapter ring. There's a small arrow indicator at the 6 o'clock side of the dial pointing to the currently set date, and it's very easy to read once you get used to the location. The date subdial is actually a bit harder to understand. In the current configuration, it's located at about the 11 o'clock position of the dial, with the hand pointing towards the first solid line on that subdial, which indicates Monday. Each solid line indicates a weekday, and the larger open side of the subdial indicates the Saturday and Sunday weekend days. Finally, we have a gauge for the oil temperature, which I assume indicates when the watch is outside of optimal operating temperatures. That said, I can't find any documentation on the Ressence website to indicate what the operating temperature range is, so I'm not really sure what might be considered too low or too high. But feel free to chime in down in the comments and let me know if you have that information. Now, as far as the feel on the wrist, this one wears really nicely, even on my 6.5-inch wrist. It's both comfortable and it's sized quite well. Being a 44mm in diameter watch, I would typically say that this is too large for my wrist, but this one just works, which I think is in no small part because of the shape of the case and the shorter perceived lug-to-lug length. Yes, it is a bit thick at 15mm, at least compared to the average watch, which usually comes in around 12mm, plus or minus, at least for sports watches, but again, it doesn't feel quite as thick as the numbers might suggest. Overall, I like the size, and the wrist presence for this one works really well for me. So what are my final thoughts on the Ressence Type 3 Triple Black? Well, the price is absolutely prohibitive, for me at least, and I'm sure for a lot of people. But that doesn't mean that the price isn't justified. There are plenty of super expensive luxury goods out there, from watches all the way up to cars, and if people are spending the money, then the price is set exactly where it needs to be. So from that perspective, I don't have any issues with the price on this one. But I do think that it's a really cool watch, and I like what they've done with it. Sure, the design is absolutely not something that resembles a traditional wristwatch, but if I'm being honest, that's what I like about it. It's different, and in a world full of Rolex homage watches, having something that's a bit different is nice to see at least once in a while. This video is presented in partnership with Exquisite Timepieces, located in Naples, Florida. Exquisite is an authorized dealer of dozens of watch brands, including Seiko and Grand Seiko, Omega, Oris, Blancpain, Breguet, and many more. Exquisite also has an amazing selection of pre-owned watches with new inventory coming in daily. So if you're looking for your next watch, check their website, exquisitettimepieces.com, or call their store at 239-227-2932, and let them know that you heard about them from Guy and the Just Blue Fish channel. I can't recommend them enough.